heading to near zero in some goods and services. And it's given rise to the sharing economy. Now, the sharing economy, some of it is being absorbed by the Ubers, if you will, but some of it is like Wikipedia, which is the 5th largest website, and we're constructing the entire knowledge of the world, and it's free, and it's not in the GDP. Or we're taking massive open online college courses and getting credit, not in the GDP. So what's happened now is we're in a hybrid economic system. Part of it would be going to provider user networks. Some of it is going to go to the sharing economy. And be clear, the sharing economy is the first new economic system to enter the world stage since capitalism in the 18th century and socialism in the 19th century. It's of a different ilk. And capitalism is metamorphosing outside of itself to something else we haven't defined yet in order to stay ahead of the game, or stay in the game. So this is kind of the framework, and then where do we go from here? The 3 major sectors that make up our second industrial revolution infrastructure are all decoupling. ICT, telecom, and internet, all of them are getting out of fossil fuels and nuclear power. Amazon, Facebook, Google, they are either totally out with secure data centers, which is most of the electricity they use, solar and wind, paid back in a few years, it's cheaper and it's plunging on the cost. I think Microsoft announced their plan yesterday to be out in a year or 2. They're all getting off. Intel, Cisco, Microsoft, Google, all of them, they're gone. That's the communication internet. And now the energy internet. So they're now decoupling, and let me explain what happened in Germany, because I worked with Sigmar Gabriel and the folks there on this transition. They didn't see this coming in electricity. There's a rule of thumb that's not well known, even by Joseph Schumpeter, on how disruptions really occur. And so when solar and wind in Germany were only 4 or 5% of the grid, who cared, you know? What they didn't realize, it wasn't so important that they were only 4 or 5%. What's important is how fast the challenger is coming into the market and how it slows down the incumbent. When solar and wind got to 14% of the electricity in the German grid and then across Europe, it was over because the investment community realized that fossil fuel and nuclears were slowing down and they were going to be in stranded assets. The US reaches 14% solar and wind in 2023, inflection. Globally, we reach it in 2028. This is where we're headed. And now, this is what you don't know. Maybe you do know. Solar and wind have been on an exponential curve like computers. Now, when I was a kid, there were no computers. The first computer was at my university, University of Pennsylvania. And the chairman of IBM at the time said, we'll need 5 computers. 5 is what we'll need. They're too expensive. They didn't anticipate the Intel engineers in the 1970s doubling the capacity on the chips. Now, smartphone, $25. We've had the same curve with solar and wind, and they all ignored it. So it used to cost $78, fixed cost 1 watt in the late 70s. It's 43 cents this afternoon, 35 cents in 18 months from now. We have power and utility companies buying long-term contracts right now this year for 5 cents, 4 cents, 3 cents, 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour because they know the curve in 20 years. And here's what you don't know. I spend time every week with the financial community, the banking community, insurance industry. Panic. It's called stranded assets. And now Citigroup, to their credit, understood what was happening here back around 2015, and they said, we may have the biggest bubble in history, $100 trillion in stranded assets across the fossil fuel industry. But what they didn't see is in 2019, the levelized cost of solar and wind dipped below natural gas and is still plunging, and the marginal cost is 0. The sun and the wind have never invoiced us. Uranium, coal, oil, gas, big price. It's over. This is the market speaking, and it's because the EU put in the 20-20-20 formula. And then China, we worked in China, moved those subsidies down, and now the market is speaking. It's more powerful than the industry. So fossil fuel stranded assets, we're talking about all the exploration rights that will never be amortized over 30 years, all of the fossil fuels that will stay under the ocean floor and the ground because they'll never be amortized out, the pipelines that will be abandoned, the petrochemical refineries that we will not use, the gas-fired power plants they're still putting in. We do not need them for backup for solar and wind anymore. We have algorithm governance that can actually deal with peak and base loads today, and storage batteries and fuel cells. And they're still putting gas-fired power plants online. Do you know that? And coal-fired power plants. And the UN announced in Madrid on the production gap that they're still putting this in, even knowing they're stranded. And another report came out at the UN saying that in the next 5 years, the proposed or already being deployed new projects in the next 5 years takes us way over 1.5, and it makes no difference anything else we do if that happens. We need a freeze. We had a nuclear freeze and a non-proliferation treaty for nuclear in the 80s. We need an immediate freeze on any further coal, oil, and gas, and just transitions to help the workers out, because they shouldn't be the victims of this. And we need a non-proliferation treaty. And guess what? 85% of all these new plants coming online in the next 5 years, you know where they're coming from? Texas, New Mexico, Alberta, and British Columbia. EU has to step forward here, because all of our good works will mean nothing. But here's where we stand at this point. With these stranded assets, we have $11 trillion that have exited this industry in the last 4 years. Does that sound impressive? 11 trillion. And they're being led by public pension funds. There is panic. And the reason is, you should know that Karl Marx could never anticipated the fact that the workers are actually the major capitalists in the world today through their pension funds. These are the deferred savings of workers that are then invested for them for their retirement. So the public pension funds started to panic a couple of years ago because they saw the coal industry going bankrupt in the US because of natural gas and now solar and wind. All the workers lost their pension, gone. And so the public pension funds of all the public employees that they're getting out, London's gotten out, New York just got out. It's all over the world. There's maybe 50, 60 major cities they've gotten out in the last 2 years. And now the private pension funds, the family funds, the sovereign funds. So $11 trillion have exited this industry, and they're desperate to engage and invest with green banks and green bonds in a third industrial revolution that can be deployed quickly because the technology is digital. It's all here, which will give all of you a lot of work to do in this room to lay out the infrastructure, create the new businesses and opportunities and performance, and move to a post-carbon economy. We don't even need new taxes. There's trillions in the private sector wanting to invest in low-interest bonds to get secure investments over 20 years. Here's the problem. We have 9,000 cities that signed up for the Global Covenant of Mayors, and the Secretariat's with us in Brussels. Meryl Sefcovic was the head of that. It's just changed. And if you talk to these 9,000 mayors and you go to their cities, they will show you their 10 beautiful, gleaming electric buses. You'll take a photo, then they'll show you their 20 LEED buildings, and you'll take a photo, then they'll show you their bike paths and the cool apps that connect them to the trams. They're all pilots. The only deployed major-scaled infrastructure project in all of Europe, believe it or not, is redoing the Victorian sewer system in London. So the market is speaking, trillions of dollars have exited, and more are coming. They're desperate to invest. And what's holding us up? The European Investment Bank did a study, and they went out and they asked all the municipalities around Europe, why are you not investing in infrastructure? You know the reason they gave? They said, we can't do it because of the Stability Compact. And that is, we can only spend up to 3% deficit to our budgets, and over 60% is the line in terms of our debt to GDP. So we can't do it. What we need now is a very careful but quick conversation, and here's what I would suggest, and that we should make a one-only time frame that all investments that go just to this infrastructure, nothing else, just lock it out, this infrastructure revolution that we need to do, it's an exception, and we invest. And we put a time limit of 20 years, which is the rollout of this infrastructure, and then it's gone and back to the normal, even within the infrastructure. We know that for every euro we invest in infrastructure, we get 2 to 3 euros back in GDP. It will be paid back. It always is. There is no loss. If we don't do this, we're not going to make it because the monies won't be there. And we're not going to tax everybody in Europe for this. So, having said that, the key question now is, how do we actually deploy this revolution? In my country, all the candidates for Democratic candidates for the president, God bless them, I love most of them, I know some of them, they misunderstand the nature of this Green New Deal. It is not going to be like the New Deal of FDR in 1932, because then we had centralized Second Industrial Revolution infrastructure, so you needed centralized government to create the jobs, the employment, put in the dams, the TVA, the electricity. But this Third Industrial Revolution infrastructure is distributed. Everyone's in the infrastructure. You have a home, if you have a business, if you have a solar panel, a charging station, electric vehicle for storage, everyone's in this. And what I think our presidential candidates have not understood is that in my country, 93% of the infrastructure is owned by the states. Can you imagine no one's mentioned this? So they have all these federal programs which are just siloed projects, no narrative that I've explained to you today, just a siloed project here, a siloed project, we're going to put $1 trillion here, $1 billion there. They're missing the narrative, which is this digital revolution you're putting together, which is what we create this Green Deal about, and they're missing the fact that 75% of the infrastructure improvements are made by the state, and they own 93%. The federal governments, and this is true in the EU, so I'll go to the EU. The EU member states will set the codes, the regulations, the standards, the incentives, the penalties, and the mandates. The member states and the EU and the EU Commission, but it'll be up to the 350 regions. They own the infrastructure mostly. They got to build this out. Now, this is a good